You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. People come to Florida in droves for the beaches and warm weather, but the Sunshine State also attracts its fair share of shady characters in real life and in fiction.
Where's my coat?
It's not one of these?
Well, do you see a black leather jacket? Fingertip length like the one Pacino wore on Serpico? Because if you don't, you owe me $379.
Well, maybe you didn't see the sign.
I seen the sign, but I didn't come to sunny Florida to freeze my ass off. You got that? So you either find my coat or you give me the $379 that my ex-wife paid for it at Alexander's.
In the opening scene of the 1995 crime caper Get Shorty, you see John Travolta's character Chili Palmer, a Miami mobster, griping about a rare spell of cold weather on Miami Beach. That movie was adapted from Elmore Leonard's novel of the same name, and Leonard is just one of a legion of writers dipping into Florida for inspiration for characters and settings from the criminal underworld. There's even a genre of crime fiction set in the Sunshine State, Florida Noir. And even if you haven't read them, you've probably heard of homegrown practitioners of Florida Noir like Carl Hiaasen, the late Tampa resident Tim Dorsey, or Randy Wayne White. You're about to hear from three people with different perspectives on Florida Noir and find out why the Sunshine State makes a great setting for shifty characters and sinister deeds. Well, Colette Bancroft is the recently retired book editor at the Tampa Bay Times. For years, she led the Times' annual Festival of Reading, and she's the editor of Tampa Bay Noir, a collection of short stories that reveal the dark side of sunny Tampa Bay. Colette, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Also joined by John Brandon, the author of 5 novels. The latest, Penalties of June, is set in Tampa. Brandon grew up in Florida and now lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he teaches creative writing at Hamline University. John, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.
And Andrew F. Gully, editor of The Strand magazine, a quarterly magazine dedicated to short fiction. A recent edition featured a previously unpublished story by famed Florida crime writer John D. McDonald. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us as well.
Good to be here.
Well, Colette, I want to start with you. How would you describe noir fiction? Is it different or similar to film noir, and where does crime fiction like Tim Dorsey or Carl Hiaasen sort of fit into that?
It is similar to film noir. I think the two sort of grew up together in the same era. And I always, my short description of what makes a story noir rather than just crime fiction, which is a much larger category, in a noir story, bad people do bad things and they get away with it.
Uh-huh. Does there have to be an element of mystery to it, or can you kind of get away with knowing the outcome and still have a good sort of noir short story or novel?
I think there's usually an element of mystery. There are probably some that don't have that, where you sort of know all along what's actually happened. But I think there's usually some element of mystery to it.
Mm-hmm. John, Penalties of June deals with a young man who's just gotten out of jail and is trying to get his life in Tampa back on track, but his associates have other ideas. I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading from part of the story. The passage I'm looking at is on page 99.
Okay. Pratt sat up straight. Malloy was coming out early, 2:00, all his stuff with him. Pratt got the LeBaron moving casually, old hat at the route to Heron's Roost. But when Malloy made a left at the end of the block instead of a right, Pratt had to cut in front of a delivery van to follow. Someplace other than work, Publix, home. Pratt would take it. He kept his mark in easy sight all the way out Blue Cove Extension to Route 19, the old, slow state road that the new expressway would make obsolete. 19 was a grand showplace of decrepit, sleazy strip malls, the traffic thickening as they headed south. A vast red-lighted intersection every third of a mile. Boat equipment emporiums, all-you-can-eat buffets. Malloy kept swerving, looking for a stronger current in the river of cars, and Pratt kept him close without leaving the center lane. Following him down into Pasco County, past a stream of catch-penny breakfast places, a half-dozen depressing bars, a mall that had bottomed into a permanent flea market. Bayonet Point, Holiday. In North Pinellas, Malloy branched onto alternate 19, a sleepier thoroughfare, and the traffic thinned. They drove past chalky limestone side roads and over short bridges that spanned mucky canals. Pratt stayed 2 cars back. He knew Malloy was headed to one of Joe Baby's places. He could feel it.
All right, so the reason I wanted you to read from this is because to me it's kind of like a nice sort of slice of Florida, and Florida from a very specific area. And there is a lot of vivid description of Tampa Bay in the 90s in this book. And a lot of it, as you kind of got a sense from that passage, is on the seedy side of Tampa Bay. So why set the book in this place and at that time?
That that's a big question. A lot of ways I can answer that. This Pasco County is where I'm from, and I had never set a novel in Pasco County. And finally, somehow it seemed like the right time. This character is the closest to any character I've written to my own sensibilities. And yeah, the story just seemed like it should take place in here because it's, there's a crime boss here, but it's sort of semi-rural, but not really, definitely not urban, kind of not even suburban, which is how Pasco County is. It seemed like the right place for it. And yeah, I didn't know you were going to ask me to read that, but I think there's like, when you talk to people about where they're from, there's like something that they just really want you to understand, and they're just not satisfied with your understanding of it. Like it was so cold, or it was so hot, or this or that. And I feel like I'm always begging people. I'm like, you just don't understand the crappiness of the strip malls. That's the defining feature to me of when I think about that area. So I'm glad you had me read that section, because that's sort of, I'd say that's like the cornerstone of that 90s setting that I grew up in, is an endless stretch of strip malls that you just cannot believe that the businesses stay open in them, and somehow they do.
Colette, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read from the opening paragraphs of your short story, which is the last in the collection. It's called The Bite. And in fact, this story won the Mystery Writers of America's Robert L. Fish Memorial Award for Best First Published Short Story. So here goes. This is just a couple of paragraphs from it. These days, it has some sunny, upscale name focus grouped by developers, but when I was a kid there, the neighborhood was called Rattlesnake. Back in the 1930s, some guy opened a rattlesnake canning plant off West Shore Boulevard near the Gandy Bridge. The suburbs hadn't sprouted there yet. The land stretching south towards Port Tampa was a couple of miles of pine and palmetto scrub with a hem of mangroves along Tampa Bay, perfect habitat for the plant's product. Locals caught the snakes by the bagful, pygmy rattlers and big diamondbacks, and sold them to the plant to be skinned and cooked. Around the south, roadside gift shops sold the cans labeled with an illustration of a coiled snake with its fangs bared over the slogan, "Tastes like chicken." It doesn't. So this is a kind of fantastic description of, again, a specific place and a very specific time. And, I mean, people who live in the Tampa Bay region, or basically anywhere in Florida now, there are still kind of vestiges of that sort of 50s, 60s era time, whether it's the architecture or some of the old businesses or even a car or two from that era. What was it for you that really resonated and made you think this is where I want to set this short story?
Well, for me, although it's not an autobiographical story, I did grow up in Rattlesnake. I grew up in the neighborhood that the story is set in. And some of the things that happen in the story come from my own childhood. So I grew up in that 1960s era in Florida when you could still buy canned rattlesnake in roadside.
So you've eaten rattlesnake? Are you telling us you've eaten canned rattlesnake?
I tried it. And it doesn't taste like chicken. It tastes pretty gross. It's sort of a stunt food, But it seemed to me like a good setting for a noir story because those kind of, people think of the suburbs in the 60s as this kind of bright and sunny and lovely nostalgic era. And it wasn't entirely. The difference was bad things happened all the time. People just didn't talk about them.
And I mean, to me, the story, it's almost like a species of horror. There's a real sense of menace to it, and it kind of transcends just mere crime, not mere crime fiction, but there's something that kind of goes beyond straight up crime writing about it. What do you think it is that makes Tampa in that time, and I guess Florida in general, such an evocative setting for a writer of noir?
I think, well, Tampa at that time had a lot of crime. organized crime in going back to the 20s and well into the 90s, I don't know,
Hmm.
was a real center for organized crime. So there was a lot of presence of the mafia, of people like that. And also because it's such a transitional place, almost everybody who lives in the Tampa Bay area, and this includes Pasco County, is from someplace else. It's people are transient. They come to Florida to reinvent themselves.
Hmm.
And often it's because they've done something not so great in other places. And if they try to change, they don't necessarily change for the good. So I think it has those kind of elements. Some of the reasons that make California such an attractive setting for noir and for crime fiction, Florida has a lot of those same qualities.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people have more innocent reasons for moving to Florida, right? Like a lot of
Oh,
the time, people would sort of see it as a place of opportunity, and that's actually a good point to bring
yeah.
you into this conversation, Andrew, and to talk about John D. MacDonald. Now, the Strand magazine published a short story by John D. MacDonald recently, and you write that it's about a young grocery clerk caught in a moral dilemma, torn between his loyalty to his employer, his strange fascination with a one-of-a-kind femme fatale, and the lure of material gain. So, just for people who maybe aren't familiar with John D. MacDonald, what should they know about him?
Well, he is, in my view, one of the most underrated noir authors. I mean, a lot of readers know about Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and James M. Cain, Cornell Woolrich, but John D. MacDonald was a writer who wrote scores of Travis McGee novels, and Travis McGee is this knight errant who lives in Florida, and he is, a private investigator, but he's a private investigator with a very good conscience. He is, always trying to do the right thing. And the works, they're not, you can't describe them as cynical as, let's say, some of the Philip Marlowe novels where you see Philip Marlowe and he's always this trying to do the best that he can, and in the end he kind of gets disillusioned by people.
Hmm.
So Travis McGee novels, they have a message about how corporations are destroying the environment. A lot of it is about how it's good to do the right thing because you can live with yourself rather than just for a moment or just for getting a wad of cash, feeling guilty and not having any self-respect for yourself. So those are some of the basic themes of John D. MacDonald's works. He was born 1916, died 1986. He served in the OSS, and he had a great story about how he had very little hopes to become a great writer because he'd get all these rejections, and they would resend him his manuscripts when they were rejected from magazines. And he said he knew how to get rid of shoe prints on manuscripts, but if somebody poured coffee or burned a cigarette hole in one of the manuscripts, he'd have to retype it again.
Hmm.
And he said that the postman, who really disliked John D. MacDonald, probably from bringing all these rejected manuscripts back to him, one day knocked on the door, and John D. MacDonald opened up the envelope, and he found a $1,000 advance for his book. And he said he would never, ever forget that date and that time.
Hmm. And he was prolific, right? He published 78 books. And you mentioned the OSS. I should clarify for people who maybe aren't familiar with this is like the precursor to the CIA. So here is somebody who had a bit of a career doing a bunch of different things before he landed in Sarasota and became a fully fledged writer. What about the story, though? How did you come across it, this previously unpublished story?
That was in the archives of the University of Florida. And I was looking through a lot of the finding aids and contacting the librarians back and forth about it. And they sent me this story, looked very promising. They sent it over to me. And I looked at it, I read it. I loved the voice. I loved the plot. I loved the twist. And an interesting twist in itself, there is another story he wrote called The Accomplice, which was published in the 80s, a few years before he had passed away. And in my panic, I said, oh my goodness, I made a mistake. I'm probably trying to publish something that's been published before. So I ended up finding a rare bookstore, getting this short story he published in the 1980s, and the stories are completely different. And interestingly, I like this one much, much, much more because this is just more raw, more earthy, and has a good message in the end. So it's not just this story that's all about plot and doesn't have any bulk of a message and a character arc.
You're listening to Florida Matters and a conversation about Florida Noir and what makes the Sunshine State, and particularly Tampa Bay, a great setting for crime fiction. Coming up, how the environment features in Florida crime fiction, and a closer look at writers who focus on Tampa Bay and the locations they write about. You're listening to Florida Matters, I'm Matthew Petty, and you're hearing from three people with different perspectives on Florida Noir, crime fiction set in the Sunshine State. Colette Bancroft is the recently retired book editor at the Tampa Bay Times. For years, she led the Times' annual Festival of Reading, and she's the editor of Tampa Bay Noir, a collection of short stories that reveal the dark side of sunny Tampa Bay. Novelist John Brandon grew up in Pasco County, and his latest novel, Penalties of June, is set in Tampa. Andrew F. Gully is the editor of The Strand magazine, a quarterly magazine dedicated to short fiction. A recent edition featured a previously unpublished story by famed Florida crime writer John D. McDonald. Colette, I wanted to just kind of come back to you for a moment because Andrew's talking about John D. McDonald's most famous character, Travis McGee, this private eye with a conscience and somebody who's very connected to and concerned about the environment. So that's a bit of a theme in Florida crime writing, right? So he may be the first of those kind of specific brand of heroes, but he's not the only one. What do you think about Florida crime fiction that kind of invites this blend of environmentalism, or even where the environment is such a kind of a big part of what people write about?
I think you're right that John D. Sort of was the granddaddy of this kind of crime fiction, but that certainly some of the best known crime fiction writers in Florida, like Carl Hiaasen and the late Tim Dorsey, have followed in his footsteps in making that kind of concern for Florida's environment and natural beauty a key component of their stories. And I think for people like Carl and Tim, the kind of depredation of the environment, destruction of the environment that we see in Florida in increasing velocity is a crime. It's sort of the original sin. You know, Florida is so beautiful, let's go in and love it to death. You know, let's go in and ruin all the things that make it beautiful. And in John D's books and Carl's books and Tim's books, the people who do that kind of thing, who exploit Florida's natural state, are the worst kind of criminals. And I think that's a kind of dilemma for people who love the state. How do you love it but not love it to death?
Yeah, and I guess some of these writers, they kind of exact some poetic retribution, right? The people who are doing the destroying often end up the worse for wear. John, I'm thinking about some of the writing and Penalties of June and sort of the vivid descriptions of the state of Florida, and you have that sense of, you know, the natural environment sort of encroaching, sometimes menacing. When you're writing about a place that has such a distinct personality almost of its own, how do you kind of write about it in a way that feels real but doesn't feel like a cliche, if that makes sense?
Oh, that's that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if there's a way that I know to do that besides line to line, you know, just going, does that sound exactly like something that I've heard before? But, you know, I think one way to kind of take a place and make it yours is to emphasize the things that are sort of important to you in it. And just in the emphasis of those things, other things get de-emphasized, and it kind of becomes, it starts to feel more like yours. You know, so if it's, what I'm always thinking about is like strip malls and corner stores, and let's use this phone booth and let's go in this gas station. That's what the whole world sort of becomes, you know, even though really it's almost like everywhere you are, there is every sort of different kind of thing. But the writer gets to choose, like, this is what I'm going to keep mentioning. This is what I'm going to keep putting the camera on. And it kind of makes a character out of the, you know, out of the landscape.
Andrew, thinking back to your, I guess, experience of reading the likes of John D. MacDonald, what was your first experience kind of stumbling across that or coming across MacDonald as a writer?
Well, what I liked about his work is that, at times, I mean, I'll tell you something. I lean more towards the Jim Thompson, Cornell Woolrich school of noir more than any other writer. And Colette will probably giggle and say that that speaks a lot about my philosophical bent, which may be a little cynical.
Hmm.
But at times you could just kind of feel, when you look at the situation in the world, and this is just in probably any moment in history, you turn on the news, and it's most of the time it's bad news. I mean, you'll rarely hear something, a headline like that smallpox has been eradicated, and you add Jim Thompson to it or Cornell Woolrich, where the world is a very dark world, and it can really, really drag you down. And what I
Hmm.
love about John D. MacDonald when I read his works is that it's not like they're very uplifting. It's not like it's this Hollywood type Technicolor ending, but there's more of a humanity. You don't feel like you've delved into this dark world of madness. I mean, I would call him noir with kind of an asterisk around it, and that it's not as hard edged as some of the real noir people, but it's just noir enough to be interesting, to have that grit in it,
Hmm.
and to just keep you reading page after page after page. And that to me is the mark of a good writer, because I've read hundreds of manuscripts, maybe thousands of manuscripts, and if you can't have me turning pages, there's no way we can publish the work. And these 6 to 10 noir authors, they knew that formula and they really excelled at it.
Hmm. Colette, for people who may be new to Florida and looking to dive into the crime fiction genre and sample some of what Florida has to offer in terms of authors, where would you recommend they start?
Well, Carl Hyacin is kind of the big dog of Florida crime writing for a reason. He's really terrific at it, and continues to be. He'll have a new book this summer called Fever Beach, and he's always great. Tim Dorsey, sadly, is not with us anymore, but he left us a couple of dozen books about surge storms. Let's see, Alex Segura. He doesn't live in Miami anymore, but he has a series of books set in Miami. Lori Roy, who is a Tampa writer, several of her books are set in Florida, and she's really good.
Colette, could I put in a quick vouch for Charles Williford?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And again, Williford has been gone for a while, but Williford probably, along with McDonald, is sort of one of the people who started Florida crime writing as a genre, as a unique genre. And Williford's books are very dark, and a lot of his books are set in Miami. And also, he's not writing as much anymore, but another former Miami resident, James W. Hall, is terrific.
Are there some
Boy.
places around Tampa Bay, Colette, that feature prominently in crime fiction that you can kind of make a location tour out of?
Tampa, I think, has not really gotten its due. My favorite Tampa crime fiction book is by a writer named Ace Atkins, who used to be a reporter for the Tampa Tribune. And he's written a number of books in about a number of different crime series, including he picked up and continued Robert Parker Spencer series for a while.
Hmm.
But my favorite of his books is one called White Shadow, and it's set in Ybor City, and it's based on the real life unsolved murder of a Tampa character named Charlie Wall, who was from a very prominent Tampa family. His father was the mayor and all that kind of thing. But he became an organized crime figure. He ran Bolita and did all these things and kind of warred with Santo Trafficante. And he was found murdered rather colorfully in his Ybor City home. And that case was never solved back in the 50s. And Ace talked to a lot of the cops who had worked it and wrote a really terrific book based on that case. It's fiction, but it's
Hmm.
based on the case. And he really captured Tampa in that historical era. And Dennis Lehane, most of whose books have been set in Boston, wrote a series of 3 books set in Tampa and in Cuba that are about organized crime in Tampa. Live by Night was made into a movie. And a few other writers have sort of dipped into Tampa. Michael Connolly, who writes about California, but who lives in Tampa part of the time, some of his books have visited Tampa. Tim Dorsey used it a fair amount because he lived in Tampa for a long time. But I think it has a lot more to give to crime fiction. I think there should be more Tampa Bay area crime fiction.
Yeah, there's certainly enough people moving here, and probably some literary folks moving down here too to kind of make that happen, I should think. I mean, crime fiction in general can sometimes hold up a mirror to society. I'm wondering what you think Florida Noir has to offer us at this moment, Colette.
I think the kinds of things that Florida crime writers focus on, like the ones that we've been talking about, are very real issues in the lives of people who live in Florida. And, when Carl Hyacin writes a book, he's writing crime fiction, and it's suspenseful, and he's also extremely funny, but it's also really solid reporting. He was, he wrote for the Miami Herald for decades, and he's a great reporter and a great analyst of what he sees. And so it's his books are, and books like them they're entertainment, but they're also about the real world that Floridians are living in. And he just magnifies it a little bit. And I think it can make people think clearly about the place where they're living and what's happening to it.
John, do you think you will return to Florida as a setting and for a future novel or another work of fiction?
Even though I have no specific plan for that, I would say definitely yes, just based on my track record. Yeah, I'll have to find, I don't like to do the exact same place or the exact same time period, so I'll have to find something new, but let's just say I hope so.
That was novelist John Brandon, who grew up in Pasco County. His latest novel, Penalties of June, is set in Tampa. You also heard from Andrew F. Gully, editor of The Strand magazine, which recently featured a previously unpublished story by famed Florida crime writer John D. McDonald, and former Tampa Bay Times book editor Colette Bancroft, who edited the short story collection Tampa Bay Noir. That's our show for this week. Florida Matters executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Gio Garvin. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and watch on YouTube. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.